Our family's trip to Europe this October was nearly 3 decades in anticipation and about 6 months in planning. Almost since he was born, Emily and I have wanted to take our son Gordon to Europe to visit places we had enjoyed on business and vacation trips of our own, and to see places he had expressed interest in. The journey evolved into this: 2 weeks abroad with the bookends of the trip as London and Paris, world capitals with their famous sights, and a couple of places in the middle where I covered Winter Olympics. In some ways, it was a mix of the famous and expected with the surprises of less well-traveled places. Come along with us on our journey, which begins in San Jose. London and Paris were at the top of Gordon's list as we planned our itinerary, and what he said he wanted to see were the big sights, museums, and monuments. Passing over Parliament. Buckingham Palace. Our overnight flights from California arrived within a couple of hours of each other on a Saturday afternoon at Heathrow Airport, and we shared a train to our hotel in Earl's Court. We got to work on Gordon's priorities Sunday by taking a walk through our neighborhood to the Underground station for a visit to the Queen's House and the surrounding royal parks that are her yard. We also visited a new and timely memorial on Westminster Bridge, which crosses the River Thames at the Houses of Parliament. Soccer, football clubs from across Britain have created a memorial to 4 tourists on this bridge who were killed in a terrorist attack last March by a motorist who drove down this sidewalk. Most of what we did in London was unscheduled. It was what we discovered on our walks through a city that is chock full of famous things to visit, like Westminster Abbey, Parliament Square, and the British Museum. The one thing we planned in advance was an evening at the theater in London's West End, where Gordon, the actor, had given me a list of plays he'd like to see. We scored tickets to the top play on his list, Oslo, which won the Tony for Best Play when it opened last year on Broadway in New York. Oslo tells the behind-the-scenes story of the Norwegian diplomats who brought together representatives of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization to negotiate a peace agreement in 1993. Our 4-day visit to Norway began rather inauspiciously. Our flight from London Gatwick landed after lunch Wednesday at the Bergen Lufthaven in a steady rain. As the airport bus took us to our hotel on the city's historic wharf, called the Bryggen, Emily, who was sitting with Gordon in the row of seats in front of me, turned and spoke through the gap. "Remind me why we're coming here again?" Her mood changed soon after we checked into the hotel. Ellie Nilsson met us in the hotel bar. She had brought a loaf of Norwegian bread that she said is traditionally served to welcome guests. She and I began to catch up on the 13 years since we had last seen each other. She was an exchange student at Richmond Senior High, the high school from my hometown of Hamlet, where I had met her on a visit. She talked about her North Carolina experiences, her university years in Norway and South Africa, her career as a legal representative with the Church of Norway. Her boyfriend Daniel was with her. "I don't care if it's raining," Emily said. "Let's see this city." And so we walked down the Bryggen to a 7-Eleven store where we bought umbrellas. We took the funicular to the top of Fløyen, one of the 7 mountains that surround the city. The rain ceased. A golden setting sun burned through the clouds to celebrate. We shared a fine meal together in a restaurant that now occupies one of the 300-year-old wood and stone warehouses on the Bryggen. Norway was a bright and cheerful place, warmed and illuminated by our friends. We set out the next morning from Bergen's railway station on a 3-train, 1 boat, and 1 bus all-day trip from Bergen to the small town of Hønefoss, where my second Norwegian friend awaited us. It would include a cruise along 2 of Norway's most spectacular fjords, Narøy Fjord and Aurlandsfjord, and a 50-minute ride on the Flåm railway, considered one of the world's great train rides. The pictures can tell the story. Road. Mm-hmm.
Are those snow shacks?
Yes. Okay, the car numbers are in the windows of the doors. Hannah Hovden met us at our hotel after breakfast Friday morning. She was the other Norwegian exchange student in Hamlet who spent her senior year at Richmond Senior in 2003 and 4. Originally from Akershus, near the capital city of Oslo, she's now a mom and high school teacher in Oppland County, where I covered the Lillehammer Winter Olympics in 1994. She was our guide for the next day and a half, taking us on a short hike that overlooked the lake in Hôtel, where our hotel was located, meeting her students and fellow teachers at her school in Gran, touring through Lillehammer and the Olympic sites that I remembered, and putting us on the train to Oslo that night. Saturday morning, she and her sons, Per and Olaf, met us on Karl Johans gate, Oslo's main street. That's the King's Place at the far end. We also met this woman. If you were having tea at her house, you'd call her Erna Solberg. But when Hannah spotted her, she said, "She's my prime minister." I couldn't get a still photo of her before she disappeared into an H&M store. We said goodbye to Hannah, Per, and Olaf at Akershus Fortress, which has guarded Oslo for 800 years, and caught our train to the airport for the next leg of our trip. In 1992, the small industrial town of Albertville, France, about an hour's drive south of Geneva, Switzerland, hosted the Winter Olympics because it was close to a lot of famous ski resorts. We made a brief pilgrimage there, where I covered Kristi Yamaguchi's successful gold medal quest in the women's figure skating on the way to the ski resort of Chamonix at the base of Mont Blanc, site of the first Winter Olympics in 1924. It's one of the few places where ordinary people and participants in one of the world's most extreme sports, mountain climbing, come together in the climber's element, on the rocks and glaciers in the tallest Alps. Ordinary folks ride the cable car to the top of 12,600-foot granite spire called l'Aiguille du Midi, the noon needle, because it points straight up. In addition to enjoying the views over the Chamonix Valley, you can meet and watch climbers arriving or leaving the needle through the ice tube. Some of them are on their way to the 15,774-foot summit of Mont Blanc, the Alps' tallest peak.
looks really cool. Okay, we're gonna.
When we drive to Los Angeles to visit Gordon, it's 330 miles and 5 hours on the road nonstop. When we turned in our rental car in Geneva after a couple of days in the Alps, we caught a French high-speed train called the TGV to Paris, 250 miles away. 3 hours, 2 stops, $68 a person first class, including food and drink. And only part of the route was on high-speed tracks, where we cruised at 186 miles per hour. It took 30 more minutes through downtown rush hour traffic by taxi to get from the Gare de Lyon, one of the world's great train stations, to our hotel 2 blocks from the Eiffel Tower. We were in time for dinner at our neighborhood brasserie and the champagne Bateau Mouche cruise down the Seine to see some of Paris' most famous sights at night.
Chaque année, à l'occasion de Paris-Plage, los acontecimientos como conciertos y una pista de patinaje. Construido en 1728, es hoy la Asamblea Nacional.
Our first priority the next day was the Louvre, probably the world's most famous art museum. And here is where we got one of the best answers to a question friends had asked before our trip. Is this a good time of the year to go? From the moment we got in line for tickets, picked up our audio guides, and were standing in front of Mona Lisa was 20 minutes tops. Emily had visited the Louvre before on a stopover returning from a business trip to Israel. When we visited together a few years later, it was summer, the lines were horrendous, and we skipped it for the Impressionists over at the Musée d'Orsay across the river. We hit d'Orsay on this trip too. Finally sated on Madonnas, baby Jesuses, and naked people, we turned to structures that are renowned for being themselves. First was the Eiffel Tower, our next-door neighbor and a monument to the technology of an earlier era. Living in Silicon Valley colored my biggest impression of the Eiffel Tower. The mechanical complexity of doing a relatively simple thing in 1889, like lifting people to a higher floor in an elevator, is on vivid display in the naked iron skeleton of the tower. It impressed people back then. It's the same complexity that thousands of coders deal with back in California today. The complexity we hold in our hands when we pick up a mobile phone. But the only ones of us who are impressed are the ones old enough to remember when this was impossible. Let's take a ride to the top. It's only 2 elevators and 3 stops.
First time I actually dared ask, you know, a lady. To be honest, I've left Kuwait City yesterday with 40 hours, so this for us is quite brief.
Voilà, c'est le deuxième étage, tout le monde descend, messieurs, dames.
No, my eyes have gotten lighter as I get older. Yeah, so you might turn like me triangular. My dad did. Thank you so much.
T'as les champs de course là-bas. Les champs de course.
The Cathedral of Notre Dame, among many other things, is a monument to persistence. It was under construction for 182 years. Nobody who saw its beginning saw its end. And for generations of workers and parishioners, nobody saw the beginning or the end. Between now and the time people set off on the first voyage beyond our solar system, I can't think of another endeavor like that humans will undertake. The Palace of Versailles, a short train ride outside Paris, was our final sightseeing spot. It's difficult to see the palace as a monument to anything but unrivaled royal wealth and privilege. That's certainly what many in France saw in it in the Revolution of 1789. It is also a monument to the American vision of pre-modern day Europe that was ruled by kings and queens who were not the figureheads we know today, but real authority-wielding heads of state. And it was a spectacular memory to carry on to our flights home the next morning. Au revoir.